The 1973 oil crisis sent gasoline prices through the roof, sparked global panic, and humiliated America at the pump. Your parents or grandparents waited in line for hours to fill their tanks. The common story says America was victimized. Arab nations weaponized oil. The West suffered. Wrong. The oil crisis was the setup. The real play happened behind closed doors in 1974, when Nixon's Treasury Secretary William Simon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Saudi Arabia and built a system so complete it would control global finance for the next 50 years. Oil did not defeat America. Oil became the instrument through which America locked the entire planet into dollar dependency. The Saudis did not win the oil crisis. They became partners in an arrangement where every barrel of oil sold anywhere on earth would require buyers to hold American currency, and every dollar the Saudis earned would flow back into U.S. Treasury securities, funding American deficits in perpetuity. This was not an oil pricing arrangement. This was a monetary architecture engineered to make the dollar untouchable. The crisis was the pressure point. The petrodollar system was the extraction mechanism. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. The infrastructure built in 1974 still determines your mortgage rate. It shapes whether your government borrows money cheaply or expensively. It dictates whether your currency holds value or crumbles. When Saudi Arabia signed its first yuan-denominated oil contract with China in 2023, financial analysts panicked for good reason. They understood something most people never learned. The petrodollar was not a theory. It was a signed agreement, and for 5 decades it made the United States the gatekeeper of global commerce. You are about to read the declassified history of how this system came to exist, who negotiated it, and why its unraveling threatens everything you take for granted about American financial dominance. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon walked into a television studio and killed the global monetary order. He announced the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The Bretton Woods system, which had governed international finance since 1944, was finished. For 27 years, the dollar had served as the world's reserve currency because foreign governments held the right to exchange their dollars for American gold. This arrangement gave foreign nations confidence in dollar holdings. It also constrained American spending because excessive dollar printing would drain Fort Knox as countries converted their paper into metal. By 1971, America had printed too many dollars. The Vietnam War consumed billions. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs required massive government spending. Foreign governments noticed the imbalance between American gold reserves and outstanding dollar claims. France, under Charles de Gaulle, aggressively converted dollars to gold, shipping the metal across the Atlantic. Other nations followed. Nixon faced a choice. He could defend the gold standard by slashing government spending and raising interest rates, triggering recession, or he could abandon gold convertibility and free the dollar from its metallic anchor. He chose the second option. The Nixon shock, as economists later named it, severed the dollar from gold and transformed it into a pure fiat currency backed by nothing except American government promises. The immediate result was chaos. The dollar fell against foreign currencies. Inflation accelerated. International markets lost confidence in American monetary management. Between 1971 and 1973, the dollar dropped roughly 20% against major currencies. Nixon and his advisors understood they had created a problem. The dollar remained the dominant global currency through institutional momentum. Central banks held dollar reserves. International contracts specified dollar payments. Trade invoicing used dollars by default. But this dominance now rested on a fragile foundation. Without gold backing, foreign nations had no fundamental reason to hold dollars except convenience and habit. If a viable alternative emerged, dollar hegemony would collapse. American borrowing costs would surge. The imperial lifestyle funded by foreign capital would end. The Nixon administration needed a new anchor for dollar demand. They found it in the desert. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated attack on Israel, beginning the Yom Kippur War. The United States airlifted weapons to Israel, tipping the military balance. Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries responded with an oil embargo against the United States and the Netherlands, nations they designated as Israeli supporters. The embargo arrived at the worst possible moment for Western economies. Demand for oil had risen steadily throughout the post-war boom. Domestic American production peaked in 1970 and began declining. The United States shifted from oil self-sufficiency to growing import dependence. When Arab producers cut exports, the price of oil quadrupled from $3 per barrel to nearly $12 within months. American drivers faced gasoline rationing. Industrial production slowed. Inflation spiked. The stock market crashed. On the surface, the embargo appeared to demonstrate American vulnerability and Arab strength. Media coverage emphasized long gas lines and humiliated consumers. Politicians denounced oil weapon diplomacy. Behind closed doors, Treasury and State Department officials recognized a different reality. The embargo created chaos, but also opportunity. Arab oil exporters now controlled an enormous and growing revenue stream. OPEC nations would soon accumulate more dollars than they could spend domestically. They needed somewhere to invest their petrodollar surplus. This was the opening. If Arab oil producers invested their dollar earnings back into American assets, particularly Treasury securities, the money would recycle into the American financial system. The dollars would leave America to pay for oil, then return to fund government borrowing. Nixon administration strategists understood the mechanism instinctively. Declassified Treasury Department memoranda from late 1973 and early 1974 show officials discussing the recycling potential of petrodollars. The key insight: oil exporters had to spend or invest their earnings somewhere. If the United States created attractive and secure investment channels, the money would come home. The question was how to formalize this arrangement and which country to approach first. Saudi Arabia was the obvious target. The kingdom held the largest oil reserves. It controlled the most spare production capacity, giving it swing producer status within OPEC. Saudi decisions about output levels moved global prices. Riyadh also faced unique security concerns. The royal family sat atop a small population surrounded by larger, often hostile neighbors. Iran, under the Shah, competed for regional dominance. Revolutionary movements threatened traditional monarchies throughout the Middle East. Saudi Arabia needed American protection. America needed Saudi petrodollars. The ingredients for a grand bargain existed. In early 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon began direct negotiations with Saudi Arabia. The documentary record of these discussions remained classified for decades. Portions appeared through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s and 2000s. Additional materials reached the public through the National Security Archive at George Washington University. The declassified cables and memoranda reveal negotiations far more comprehensive than any public announcement suggested. American officials offered Saudi Arabia a package with multiple components. First, the United States would provide an explicit security guarantee. American military equipment would flow to Saudi Arabia. American advisors would train Saudi forces. In the event of external attack, American intervention would protect the kingdom. This commitment remained informal rather than treaty-based, avoiding Senate ratification requirements. But the understanding between governments was clear and binding. Second, the United States would support the Saudi position within OPEC on production and pricing decisions. Washington would not pressure Riyadh to dramatically lower oil prices in ways that threatened Saudi revenues. Moderate price increases would receive tacit American acceptance. Third, American technical and economic assistance would modernize Saudi infrastructure. Joint commissions would coordinate industrial development, military procurement, and educational exchange. In return, Saudi Arabia committed to three critical obligations. The kingdom would price all oil exports in U.S. dollars. This requirement applied not only to Saudi-American bilateral trade, but to all Saudi oil sales worldwide. Every barrel of Saudi crude, regardless of buyer, would require payment in American currency. The kingdom would invest surplus petroleum revenues primarily in U.S. Treasury securities. The Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency would purchase American government debt as the default destination for funds exceeding domestic spending needs. This commitment recycled petrodollars directly into American government financing. The kingdom would use its influence within OPEC to maintain dollar-denominated oil pricing across the cartel. Saudi Arabia would resist any member nation's attempt to price oil in alternative currencies. David Spiro's 1999 book, The Hidden Hand of American Hegemony, documented these arrangements using Treasury records, Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency data, and declassified State Department materials. Spiro traced the flow of funds from oil sales through Saudi accounts into Treasury holdings. By 1975, Saudi Arabia held billions of dollars in Treasury securities. Through special arrangements with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, these holdings grew alongside oil revenues, reaching tens of billions by the early 1980s. The Federal Reserve created unique accommodations for Saudi accounts. Declassified records show special custody arrangements and confidential reporting procedures that shielded Saudi holdings from public disclosure. When the Treasury Department published foreign holdings data, Saudi assets received protection from detailed itemization. Congressional testimony from the late 1970s and 1980s confirmed the petrodollar relationship without revealing its full terms. Treasury officials acknowledged the importance of OPEC investment in American securities. GAO reports tracked recycling flows. But the explicit quid pro quo between security guarantees and monetary arrangements remained officially unacknowledged for decades. The Saudi agreement established the template. American diplomats extended similar arrangements to other Gulf oil producers throughout the 1970s. Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and eventually other OPEC members adopted dollar pricing and Treasury investment patterns. The architecture had three reinforcing layers. The first layer was bilateral commitment. Each major oil exporter maintained its own arrangement with the United States, calibrated to local security needs and production volumes. American military equipment sales created dependence on American spare parts and training. Defense relationships made the oil for security exchange concrete and ongoing. The second layer was OPEC coordination. Saudi Arabia used its market share and spare capacity to enforce cartel discipline. When member nations considered alternative pricing currencies, Saudi production decisions could flood markets and punish defectors. The kingdom served as American proxy within the organization, maintaining dollar orthodoxy through economic leverage. The third layer was structural incentive. Once dollar oil pricing became standard, all oil importers needed dollar reserves to purchase energy. Japan, Germany, France, South Korea, and developing nations alike accumulated dollar holdings to fund oil imports. These reserves created secondary demand for Treasury securities, as central banks sought safe, liquid dollar-denominated assets for their holdings. The structural incentive proved self-reinforcing. The more nations needed dollars for oil, the more they held dollars in reserve. The more they held dollars in reserve, the more they purchased Treasury securities. The more they purchased Treasury securities, the lower American borrowing costs fell. The lower borrowing costs fell, the more America could sustain trade deficits and military spending without fiscal consequences visible to voters. This was the petrodollar machinery in full operation. It transformed a commodity transaction into a financial architecture. Oil buyers funded American government operations as an invisible tax embedded in energy purchases. The system also created enforcement bottlenecks. Any nation seeking to exit dollar dependency faced immediate problems. Selling Treasury holdings would depress prices and inflict losses on the seller. Abandoning dollar reserves would leave no alternative liquid asset of comparable depth and security. Pricing oil in non-dollar currencies would strand existing infrastructure and contracts denominated in dollars. These switching costs protected the system from gradual erosion. Only coordinated action by multiple major players could threaten dollar hegemony. Individual defection imposed costs on the defector while leaving the system intact. Americans rarely understood how the petrodollar system subsidized their standard of living. The mechanism operated through interest rates, trade balances, and government borrowing, channels invisible to ordinary citizens. Start with government finance. When foreign nations recycled petrodollars into Treasury securities, they increased demand for American government debt. Higher demand meant lower interest rates. Lower interest rates reduced the cost of federal borrowing. The government could run deficits without facing punishing rates that would otherwise force spending cuts or tax increases. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the United States ran persistent budget deficits while borrowing at relatively low rates. Foreign treasury purchases, particularly from oil exporters and Asian manufacturing nations, recycling their trade surpluses, funded these deficits. American voters enjoyed government services without paying the full tax bill. Foreigners covered the gap. The trade deficit operated similarly. The United States imported more goods than it exported year after year for decades. Under normal circumstances, this imbalance would crash the dollar as foreigners accumulated currency they could not spend. But petrodollar recycling and reserve accumulation absorbed the excess dollars. Foreigners held American currency and securities rather than dumping them on markets. The dollar remained stable despite persistent trade imbalances. American consumers benefited from cheap imports. Chinese manufacturing, Japanese electronics, German machinery, and oil from around the world flowed into American ports. Payment flowed out in dollars that foreigners held rather than exchanged. The American lifestyle was partially funded by foreign savings trapped in a system with no exit. Military spending also connected to petrodollar flows. The defense budget consumed hundreds of billions annually, projecting American power across the globe. This spending would have generated massive fiscal pressure in the absence of cheap foreign borrowing. Petrodollar recycling made deficit-financed military dominance sustainable. The arrangement had critics. Some economists warned about mounting foreign claims on American assets. The net international investment position deteriorated as foreigners accumulated Treasury securities and other American holdings. Future generations would service this debt through interest payments flowing abroad. But the short-term benefits overwhelmed long-term concerns and political calculations. Cheap borrowing, stable currency, and affordable imports created prosperity that voters attributed to American productivity rather than monetary architecture. Few understood the hidden subsidies embedded in dollar hegemony. The oil exporters also faced critiques. Domestic populations in Saudi Arabia and Gulf states watched petroleum revenues flow to American securities rather than local development. Some argued the monarchies traded natural resource wealth for paper claims on a foreign government, exchanging real assets for financial instruments subject to American legal jurisdiction and potential seizure. The royal families calculated differently. American security guarantees protected their regimes from internal and external threats. Treasury investments represented savings in the world's safest and most liquid market. The arrangement suited ruling families, even if it diverted wealth from broader populations. For 50 years, the petrodollar architecture faced periodic challenges without fundamental disruption. Saddam Hussein's 2000 decision to price Iraqi oil in euros alarmed American strategists. The Iraq War, whatever its public justifications, eliminated that threat and restored dollar pricing after regime change. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed African oil sales in gold dinars before NATO intervention ended his government. Iran's oil bourse, denominated in non-dollar currencies, remained limited by sanctions and isolation. These challenges came from weak and isolated states that the United States could pressure or destroy. The architecture survived because no major power mounted a coordinated alternative. The 2020s brought different conditions. China emerged as the world's largest oil importer. Saudi Arabia grew frustrated with American policy shifts, from shale production that competed with Saudi exports to human rights criticisms that offended royal sensitivities. The Ukraine war and subsequent Russian sanctions demonstrated that dollar-denominated assets faced seizure risk for nations that crossed American interests. Russia's frozen reserves sent a message to every nation holding Treasury securities. The United States would weaponize the financial system against adversaries. Countries outside the American alliance structure noted the precedent. In 2023, Saudi Arabia signed agreements to accept Chinese yuan for oil sales. The volumes remained small relative to total Saudi exports, but the symbolic break with exclusive dollar pricing signaled that the 50-year arrangement was negotiable. BRICS nations discussed alternative payment systems and potential shared currencies. China and Russia settled increasing bilateral trade in yuan and rubles rather than dollars. India experimented with rupee-based oil purchases from Russia after sanctions disrupted dollar channels. These developments do not yet threaten dollar dominance. The structural advantages remain enormous. Treasury markets offer depth and liquidity unmatched by alternatives. Central banks hold roughly 60% of reserves in dollars. Inertia protects incumbent systems. But the trajectory matters. Foreign central bank holdings of Treasury securities peaked as a share of the outstanding debt and began declining. China reduced its Treasury position from over $1.3 trillion to under $800 billion over recent years. Japan trimmed holdings. Private foreign investment replaced some official flows, but the political foundation of dollar dominance eroded. The original petrodollar bargain rested on a specific exchange, security for monetary loyalty. American security guarantees protected Gulf monarchies. Gulf monetary practices protected American financial dominance. Both sides calculated benefits exceeded costs. Today, the calculation shifts. Saudi Arabia pursues normalization with China. The kingdom develops military relationships with multiple suppliers. American shale production reduced dependence on Saudi oil even as global markets remained integrated. The mutual necessity that drove the 1974 agreement weakened. American policymakers face a structural problem they did not create and cannot easily solve. The petrodollar system provided benefits that American voters now expect as normal conditions: cheap borrowing, stable currency, affordable imports, and unconstrained deficit spending feel like natural features of American life, rather than products of a negotiated arrangement with foreign monarchies. If the arrangement unwinds, Americans will experience the consequences through higher interest rates, currency instability, and fiscal constraints that force painful choices between spending priorities. The political system shows little capacity to explain these connections to voters, much less to prepare them for adjustment. Understanding the 1974 negotiations illuminates the stakes. The petrodollar was never a theory or an abstraction. It was a deal signed by specific officials, documented in cables and memoranda, and enforced through security relationships and financial architecture. Its origins reveal its vulnerabilities. Its conditions reveal what must hold for it to persist. You now know what most people never learn. The dollar's global role did not emerge from American economic virtue or natural market selection. It was engineered through diplomatic agreements, security guarantees, and financial mechanisms that locked the world into dollar dependency. That lock is not permanent. The keys are changing hands. 50 years ago, American officials flew to Saudi Arabia and built a system designed to survive the death of gold-backed money. They succeeded beyond reasonable expectation. The petrodollar funded half a century of American deficits, military adventures, and consumer abundance. The system worked because both parties needed what the other offered. American security matched Saudi oil. Saudi investment matched American borrowing needs. The exchange created mutual dependence that neither side could easily exit. Today, the dependence loosens on both ends. Saudi Arabia cultivates alternative security partners. The United States produces oil domestically. China offers markets and investment that rival American capacity. Russia demonstrates the costs of dollar dependence for nations outside American favor. The documents from 1974 describe a world built on specific assumptions: American military dominance in the Middle East, Saudi vulnerability to external threats, and universal need for dollar-denominated oil purchases. Each assumption has weakened. You live in the late period of the petrodollar system. Whether it persists for another decade or fragments into competing currency zones remains unclear. What you now understand is how the system originated, what sustained it, and what conditions must hold for it to continue. The money trail runs from the oil fields of Arabia to the Treasury buildings of Washington. It runs through your mortgage rate, your government's budget, and your currency's purchasing power. The history they never taught you in school is the history that still controls your life.